Compare the Doric and the Ionic capital. The difference between them is profound, underlined by their different geographical location. Yet both temple styles derive from the same background, at the same point of time. Only Didyma, the most famous oracular shrine of Apollo and second only to Delphi, can give us some conception of the gigantic temples so characteristic of Ionic building in Asia Minor. Now we have only the ruins of the rebuilt temple, constructed at the time of Alexander the Great on the foundations and after the plan of the earlier one which had been destroyed by the Persians. The double colonnade of 120 columns is surrounded by a walled precinct which contained the cult chamber of Apollo, as well as the sacred spring and laurel grove under the open sky. The proportions of the Ionic temples aim at the gigantic, but also at the light and lofty. The columns of Didyma are over 60 feet high with a diameter of 6 feet at the lower level. By contrast, the columns of the Doric temple of Hera at Paestum were barely 30 feet high, yet had a lower diameter of more than 6 feet. The whole elevation, column, and entablature of Hera's Paestum temple could have been accommodated within the great entrance portal at Didyma. There is no pediment at Didyma. Perhaps none had ever been planned. No triglyphs and metopes, and therefore no angle conflict. Slender columns soar effortlessly, carrying the light entablature. The continuous frieze of carved ornament above the architrave echoes the carved column bases below. Work on this later temple of Didyma was continued over 5 centuries, from Alexander the Great down to the reign of the Emperor Hadrian. It was never finished. The Temple of Artemis at Ephesus has left us a few remains and a description or two from ancient writers. Again, there was an earlier temple, burnt down by Herostratus, and a successor to replace it of the same plan and dimensions. Pliny, counting as usual, listed 127 columns and noted that the marble was bluish. Of deeper import, far back in holy isolation under the open sky, great Artemis stood. A later copy gives us an idea of the famous goddess, mistress of the animals, calm-eyed and many-breasted, with a rich mouth. She had her hands then. What was it she held in them, this nurturer of men? The Doric Temple of Zeus at Olympia. The Ionic Temple of Artemis. Its area is greater than that of the biggest Gothic cathedral in Europe. The cella was uncovered. The Ionic temple confined its sculpture to 2 places, one just above the column base, where no Doric architect would ever have put it, because there it denied the function of the column as a constructional element. Here is such a piece, life-size relief figures from the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus of the later classical period, and now in the British Museum in London. A woman between Hermes, messenger of the gods, and death personified in Theratos, youth with sword and huge eagle's wings. The other spot for sculpture in the Ionic temple was the frieze above the architrave. Not many such friezes have survived. One of them that has is archaic, about 20 inches high, from a treasure house in Delphi. Uninterrupted by triglyphs, unconfined by the frame of a metope, a band of relief sculpture glows continuously with the battle of the gods against the giants. These magnificent giant temples of the Ionian East inspired imitations in Doric territory. This happened particularly in Sicily, where there was no lack of wealth or space, and the settlers, though of Doric descent, were independent and conscious of their own artisan strength. Selinus was colonized by Megara, the neighboring city of Athens. 7 great temples stood on 2 hills within the city. They were all destroyed by earthquakes, their pillars flung down like a series of proverbial dominoes. What is here seen to be standing was restored in the present century. This enormous mass of ruins, known as Temple G, was sacred to Apollo. Fragments of the entablature of capitals and column drums are all of a size hitherto unheard of for a Doric temple. The Ionic Temple of Apollo at Didyma boasted columns 65 feet high with a lower diameter of 6 feet. Temple G at Selinus was 54 feet high with a lower diameter of 11 feet. The aim of the builders was to achieve the Ionic measure and surpass it. The columns of Temple G were blocked out when they were quarried, 7 miles from the city. Here we can study in detail one of the many technical methods practiced in antiquity. A narrow channel, some 25 to 30 inches broad, was drilled and chiseled into the living limestone. The column drum was thus blocked out, with the tapering of the column taken into account. The drum is over 12 feet high, with a circumference of 36 feet. Later, the drum was disengaged and removed on wooden rollers from the quarry. These columns were, in proportion of height to circumference, the most enormous ever to have been built into a Greek temple. But some of these columns were not even fluted, and because we know that flutes were usually cut only at the final stage, when the column was already standing, we also know that the project was never finished. At another unfinished temple in Segesta, the bosses for attaching pulleys and lifting tackle are still there, for these are not removed until a building is completed. The epidermis, or outer layer, of the stone has not even been cut down to the finished surface. The previous surface served as protective skin against damage during building operations, so the final stage was never reached at all. The propylaeum, or vestibule, of the Athenian Acropolis serves to show that the blocks fit so closely that no binding material was needed. Once the final surface was achieved, stone lay flush on stone. Acragas, the present-day Agrigento, boasted of no fewer than 10 Doric temples, 5 of which lined the city wall. The stone is earthy brown, porous limestone, quarried locally. Its coloring bears no relation to the original appearance of this chain of temples. The stone was once covered in stucco, a luminous white, enlivened with strong, clear colors. There are still traces of the stucco, ground marble dust, which was applied over the surface.